Thank you everyone for being with us today for this very, very special talk featuring the three creators behind Ceremonial Enactments, one of the commission for this year's Singapore International Festival of Arts. And here we have with us the very lovely Riduan Zalani, who is the Artistic Director of Nadi, Singapura, and who is also the creator of 293 Degrees Northwest. And then we also have the very, very wonderful Meenaksy Bhaskar, the Artistic Director of Bhaskar Arts Academy, who is presenting Yantra Mantra alongside the works of the late, great Mrs. Santa Bhaskar, who passed away very recently, and whose legacy we also want to honor and celebrate through this talk today. And last but not least, we have the very lovely MAX.TAN of the design label MAX.TAN, self-indicated. Brilliant. And Max is also helming costume design for a couple of SIFA productions, so please do keep a lookout for his brilliant, brilliant works. And yes, I guess, just to start things off, because I've seen everyone's material and I've been equal parts entranced and enthralled a multitude of other adjectives and verbs that, you can just throw there and it will probably still fit, the entire spectrum of marvel, marvelous, etc. And yeah, I think, the one thing that kind of stuck with me is because, even though it is built as ceremonial enactments, but we all know that in reality it is four works. It is the works of Max, it is the works of Meena and Mrs. Santa Bhaskar, and it's the works of Riduan that kind of share a certain kind of affinity and certain spaces and context together. But there is that sense of personal agency, and it's also very apparent from everyone's titles. And so my first question really revolves around that first interface with the audience, and I just want to take the time to ask everyone, what is the process behind how you came up with the title of your work, and how has it evolved from since when you first envisioned it? And I guess we can go from a chronological order and start with Max and Ang.
Yes, so I think speaking to Natalie, she gave each of us a theme, and the theme, the word that was given to me was birth. And I mean, fashion, I can't take it the linear way. I couldn't be possibly putting up a collection of 42 maternity looks. So, and I mean, there's so much respect for a woman's body that goes through pregnancy and then birthing a child and strain it causes on the body, and I don't know how to embody that. And this is where I had a chance to speak to Natalie when she was telling me, oh, bring it back to a personal story, relate it back to your mom. And well, as I age, the question of mortality really comes up. And I see this piece as a conversation that is, although it primarily revolves around birth, but I think this piece, and in the preparation of these pieces is kind of a preparation for us eventually saying goodbye to each other. Yeah, and that's with me and my mom. I dug back into her Hokkien roots, and because it's a sartorial love letter to my mom, I use her surname, which is Ang. It's Hong, 三点水红 in Mandarin, and it's also, Hong is also a xie to red, and red is such an important color to the Chinese culture, so that's why I stuck with red.
Yeah. And thank you so much for that, because as Max mentioned, the 三点水红, as a surname, it can also in a way refer to deluge, to water, to the great bodies of water that nourish us, and just like how in great civilizations they're almost always found alongside large bodies of water, there is that kind of liquidity that leads to the fertility of certain generosities of spirits. And I think this is a very elegant meditation on that. And then, moving on to the second word, tell us about 293 Degrees Northwest and its delicious GIS, geosophical inflections. Sounds like a coordinate, but where?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the most merciful. I think that is where everything began. 290 Degrees Northwest is a way for us to relook at the layers embedded in the wedding ceremony of the Muslims, of the Malay people, and most importantly, how it is like now in Singapore. When Natalie approached me was over Yakun Kaya. Yakun Toast. I was very surprised why she came forward and invited me for lunch. I didn't know what it's about. And then she delivered her next line was, we want you to create a piece for SIFA. And I was okay, I am the artistic director of Nadi, Singapura, and we've been together for 10 years. And I know them and I treat them, we treat each other as a family. So how this entire 293 Degrees Northwest began was, I relook at the strength of my ensemble. I relook at what the Malay community practice and what remains intact for Malay Singaporeans, and what is a universal theme across anybody in this world. And I find that 293 Degrees Northwest, if you haven't know it, it is where the Kaaba is from Singapore. And for me, it's a very significant way of telling people, you can be wherever you are, you know, but where is Kaaba? And I will unpack that in the wedding itself, because these are the things that's not said. But personally, drawing from personal stories, I'm married with 2 kids, and I think it's one of the biggest change maker in one's life. So you will hear drums, because that's what we are. We are drummers primarily. All new compositions, inspired from tradition, inspired from all these activities that you see, that you dream of, that you know we have missed it over the last 2 years because of COVID. You know, we haven't seen any of this big gathering. Furthermore, living in Singapore, HDB flats, the sight from 11-story looking at the Kumpang group going down, that's something very Singaporean.
Yeah, very true.
People nowhere can feel that. So these are the things that that drive us in creating this show. Yeah. The name just came after my conversation with Natalie. I think Feza was representing SIFA, and I think our set designer Randy was there. We were just throwing ideas, and they saw my writing. He said, "Riduan, this is a good title." Oh yeah. For a while I didn't know how to coin or how to because the Malay wedding is just majlis persandingan. Yeah, but I'm glad we all agree that it's a good starting point.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because in a way, I think having, for example, a set of coordinates, it also, of course, alludes to the idea of orientation and orienting. And in a way, rituals are also our ways of orienting our being in this world. Because, for example, in the many works of noted anthropologists and scholars on magics and faith, the idea of kind of corporeal technique is something that is very, very prevalent, or rather it's something that's universal, because these ways of making an embodied sense is really just a very pure way of being, of knowing where you are and how you are and when you are in relation to any other entity at all. And I also really enjoyed the elements of percussion, because percussion in music, particularly, I guess for me, because I'm not musically trained, has such a distinct texture. And for example, in a lot of scientific studies, percussion is one of those musical elements that actually have a much more somatic response, because your heartbeat, when it follows a syncopated beat, for example, as opposed to melodies, as opposed to tenors that can maybe create inflections in your mood, but you don't feel that hitting you as much as percussive beats, as when those air molecules are vibrating and hitting your eardrums. And so from then on, it also of course gets me thinking about the idea of rhythms, of beats, of movements, and how these are very very mythical in a way, because there's a certain number to it. It moves. it is completely unrelated, but you can't spell algorithm without rhythm, so there you have it. And from then on, I also want to then, ask, about, Yantra Mantra, and of course, the geometries and the rhythms that are present in this work, and of course, your own ways of negotiating that meaning for yourself, and of course, working with the legacy of the late great Mrs. Santa Bhaskar.
Yes, unlike the two of them, I kind of came on this accidentally. I guess the universe decided that it was for me to be doing this. So for me, Yantra and Mantra not just embodies the spiritual aspect of it, but also continuation. When we do rituals, it is for not just for our generation. I mean, I'm talking about culturally, Hindu generation, even karma, the idea of karma. We do good karma for our future generations. So when we do good, it's not just for us, but we're securing a better life for our children, our grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and the future generations. So I guess the cleansing and all of that, although it feels like, cleaning and preparing for death, but it's also preparing for the next life, and not just our spiritual next life, but also the continuation of the existing generations, So the geometry and the math and all of that is just a vehicle to get us there. And of course, in dance also we have that spiritual aspect where our body is sacred. The space we dance in is so sacred. The music is sacred. So it's all about bringing all of these elements in together and then finding that connection and finding that disbursement into sharing, Yeah, so it's totally different. I'm not sure how, I can't be in my mom's mind, and she's not here to speak for herself, but I can speak for how this is resonating for me. So I guess that's how it's resonating for me.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you so much, because I think, the idea of the sacred and of course the converse, the profane, also brings with it a very, very specific and somewhat loaded kind of nuance to it, because I think the visuality, for example, the materiality and visuality of sacredness, it also occurs on multiple fronts. What is considered to be a public spectacle of the sacred is so much different from the intimate sacred of our bodily autonomy and boundaries. And I think what is particularly interesting for me is also, for example, in the entire corpus of ceremonial enactments, you also see this kind of sacredness taking shape in these different scales and perspectives. Because in the body of a birthing woman, the body of a soon-to-be mother, and then the body of a mother, they occupy a different kind of visuality also within the context of a traditional Chinese society, however you want to define traditional, however you want to define Chinese. And of course, her being Hokkien herself, it also creates this additional angle and inflection from which her experience could be derived. And also then, in 293 degree Northwest, the sacredness of a public spectacle is then different from the more spiritualized version, for example, in paying obeisance to higher powers and devotionals. But nonetheless, it is a celebration of this higher power that brings people together and then imparts this larger sense of joy that goes beyond, even what the wedding ordinarily is about, which is two people getting married, but it's not. It's about the community. It is about this wider society and spaces and bodies that these two specific bodies exist within. And of course, as Meena mentioned, then there's also that specific angle of the body, the spaces being sacred, and there being that particular spiritual valency. And I guess it is from this perspective that I also want to ask everyone on the idea of choreography, of organizing being through space. Because these are not uniform spaces and these are not neutral spaces. They carry with them, the impacts of ideologies, of power constructs and relation that run through it. Because even if you are a devout worshipper, unfortunately, in this world, a worshipper is not a neutral worshipper. A worshipper is always bringing with them a certain kind of context and negotiating certain ways of becoming, because their worships are always in relation to, in a way, some others' worships. And this is, and yeah, I guess I also just want to start with Max and on, you know, how did you navigate the presence of your mother's bodies, you know, vis-a-vis the way you work with your performers' bodies, and of course the way that the garments create this almost secondary or annexed body themselves. Because there are these multiple tactilities and multiple corporealities that I think is also what is so fascinating about garments and worn material.
Yes, I think to answer the question, I cannot avoid speaking about how the relationship or what we see when we see a fashion show, and the title of this year's SIFA is an anatomy of a performance, and then what is the anatomy of a performance, a fashion show to me. And I think most people, and myself included when I was a student, and when I look at a fashion show, it's always, oh, okay, that's the model is the body, and then the model is the performer, and these are just clothes. But I think what I want to show and question is, what if the performers are the clothes, and then the body is just the stage, which these performers are performing on, and that leads me to, I mean, thinking about all these layers with my mom and all that. But in particularly, the collection takes the journey of my mom as a young girl, a woman, and then, you know, how her budding of me and my sister informed my draping strategies, in which the collection was derived from. For a start, for example, when I am working on draping on a tailor's dummy or a stand, we usually follow the contours of the tailor dummy. But this time around, our approach, it's rather unsafe, and I think this reflects how childbearing is a relatively unsafe and a very fragile process. So a garment is made, a mock-up was made, and we introduce some incisions in the style of a cesarean birth onto the garment, and then see what kind of new information is being birthed out of that. And the silhouettes really do follow the journey of an aging woman, the journey of a mom, and all of that, yeah, without giving away too much.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Also interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm imagining everything that you
No,
said.
Yeah.
no, it's very intangible to me. Like, you know, this budding is such a, and it's so intangible to present it as a visual outcome and as a and still draw some connections there. So I think my approach is rather lateral in this case, a little bit abstract, very collage that is really a reflection of my collage mind, and I'm still trying to put the pieces together actually.
But I like your idea of having the garment as your
The performers.
Yeah, I really like that, because really that's your work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the body is the space, and that's I would never have looked at it that way. Thank you. Yeah.
No, and because precisely what's also interesting is then, you know, in that iterative process, it's also where we can see a genealogy that's taking place. And a genealogy, of course, there's a certain linearity to it, but then it, much like the roots of trees, it branches out, and it is never a clear reflection, because it's almost always a process of refraction instead, because we go through different phases in life. Womenhoods take on different dimension depending on your age, on your body, on the socioeconomic class, education, everything. And I think particularly that idea of danger and precarity is also then so central to how even till now, women have to negotiate multiple identities, because we haven't reached necessarily a stage where we could have a singular being. When we think of unmarkedness and markedness in linguistics, the default is still mankind, human, and, you know, the metrics, the meter, the Vitruvian man is the first measure. But what is the Vitruvian man apart from an actual Vitruvian man, of a certain build, of a certain height, of a certain body type, of a certain persuasion? And I think, you having that process is also what makes it so electrifying as well. Yeah, and then, kind of moving on to Riduan and choreographies, I'm also particularly interested because you have to balance the idea of performance in the theatricality of the articulation towards a gaze, but also having to balance the actual performing of instruments.
Yeah.
In many cases. And as we know, the embodiments of a performance between someone playing with the instruments also then different from someone who only has their bodies to work with. So, are then instruments an extension of the body, or are they accessory to it that accentuates? And yeah, I just want to pick your brain on this.
Okay. Right from the first day when Nadi Singapura was formed, until today, I cannot define what is actually Nadi Singapura as an ensemble. Is it a music group? Is it a dance group? Is it a theatre group? What is it? What is it? I came from a background, and based on my experience, my travels, and whatever that I've studied, read, and I thought about, this is actually the essence of how civilizations started. They don't define. We come together, and it feels like playing some music. Somebody starts playing music, somebody expressed by dancing, and then we get a narrative, and then so I think what Nadi is and how I approach this work is that's the way this work has been developed. Yes, at its most basic, the music is the main driver, because the instruments are the reason why we are connected as an ensemble. That's why I can assure you, if I bring a team in, you would feel that they are not, I don't pay you because you are here. I want to be here because I love you, and I know that you're having an exam this week. After this, you go home and study. Everybody know each other's baggage, but we want to spare time to creating this work. So 293 degrees and how I maneuver around it is really about understanding, okay, the layers of the Malay wedding is this. What is the ritualistic aspect, the spirituality, the cultural aspect. And then after that, I want to know the journey for the bride and the groom, because it's very personal. It is undefined terrain. This is something that if you don't go through it, you will never know. And then I wanted to also cherish that, and then I want to be able to also show that the entire village is praying for you, because ultimately we want the best for you, and we will be there to witness you from you idling until you finding a mission in your life, and then you feel that she's the one or he's the one, and then you decide to move on. And we are here to remind you that it is beyond that, and that's where I think, without revealing too much, and I'm also in the process of packing the experience, the journey, how the instruments become part of, how the body becomes an instrument. We sing, we dance, we speak a lot, and we generally have a lot of fun on stage, and that, I think that's the most important thing. The stage is indeed a very sacred space for me too. I regard it as, only the chosen ones on stage, and I respect that gift. So to prepare the ensemble for ceremonial reenactments, for me, that in itself is magic. And
yeah, no, I really, really love it, because what you have brought up, I think, also touches on how everyone is also responding to bodies and being together in that, sociality, the idea of, coming together as a community, that is also subject to the conditions of indeterminacy, because you can't quantify it. It is one and many at the same time. You do this and that, and all of them together. There's no clear way of division, and I think that, in a way, that is also a very good bulwark against a certain empiricism, where certain roles, particularly in performance makings, are so stratified. Like, oh, you are the playwright, you are the director, you are the dramaturg, you are the this and that and that and this. But being able to be there and say, but we are all doing this together, I think that creates in a way, that sense of equity that is also so refreshing, because ultimately it also speaks to a kind of equality from the position of a higher power, of being able to come together on our same terms, and to be able to celebrate and be joyous. And I think that is what's so beautiful. But the part about interdeterminacy is also something super interesting, because I know, for example, in the various forms of classical Indian dances, there is a vocabulary and there are idioms, and there is rigor. And from one particular cosmology that celebrates that, in a way, that kind of messiness, that indeterminacy of being together, of being unable to tell, then there are also, of course, the hyper-specific vernaculars that are present. And I'm really curious then, for example, in how you managed to negotiate that way of creation from using the hyper-granular and being able to then create your own new idioms and languages and expressions, or rather your sentences from the existing phrases. Yeah.
I think the vernacular is so vast and so forgiving and so current, even though it's so ancient. Even when we study the alphabets of the hand gestures, at the end of it, we have to memorize. Okay, for example, the hand gesture pataka. We have a whole list of usage. You memorize the usage. You can show you can show me, you can show flag, you can show everywhere. So at the end of it, and use it according to your time. So I think that makes it so current and makes it so, how do I say? What is a word? Not traditional, but
contemporary.
Contemporary. There you go. So, I think we struggle with this identity of tradition and contemporary. What was contemporary 100 years ago is tradition today. So who are we to say that? And I really like the fact that you don't define yourself, because I feel like putting yourself in a box kind of limits yourself sometimes. And I've been a box. I'm in a box of traditional dance, but I try not to think about that. Just like you, I try not to think that, oh, I am a traditional dancer, I have to do this. I try to go by, what does this speak to me? So going back to your question about the precision and all of that, yes, we have this vernacular and all of that, but then there's so many things we're trying to show in this that we have to get creative, because, we have hand gestures for each of the planets. We're doing the planets and the nine planets and the 9 corners, the Navasandhi. So with that, each planet has its own hand gesture, and then each planet has, each direction has its own hand gesture. Now, how do we bring the rituals of the two together and, combine the two? And that's what I'm working on right now. So.
Yeah, I want to ask you, or rather maybe I want to pull on that thread a little further, because I am so fascinated, for example, in the divisions to the 9 and to the 9 directions and to the 9 planets, and of course to the 9 gods, because it also signifies a way of division that in a way is more clear cut, I would say, as compared to that, say, the proceedings of a wedding, which kind of can be taken as a whole with different phases, as opposed to different segments. So would you mind maybe telling us a little bit more about how then did you work to create the languages of these different 9 sections, or are they still drawing from a certain consistency?
They're drawn from a certain consistency. We have the Navasandhi Kautums, which were written, and also the Navagraha Kritis. So these were written a few hundred years ago, composed based on the qualities of these different directions and based on the different qualities of these demigods. So the text is already there. It's using the text, putting music into it, and then creating it around all of that. Again, don't want to give it too much. But so the text is already there. The text is already in existence, and we're using that text as a platform then to create this form of cleansing and the rituals. Yeah. The rituals are already in there. So, yeah. So it's very, very specific and very in the box. So how do I make it out of the box? Because then we've got the space that's non-traditional, right? So let's explore. That's the exploration without giving up too much. Yeah.
No, because I think from then on, it brings me to, I would say, a very, very specific kind of question of the gaze, of the position of viewing. Because from now, we have been talking about, what is behind creating, of conceptualizing, of bringing together. But, existing within an art festival also means that we don't create in a silo of documentation. We create to react to the active context of being watched, of being gazed at, of having certain kind of lenses trained on us, or multiple different lenses trained on us. And this is also something that is tied part and parcel to, I would say, certain formats of performances, and of course how then they have been reinterpreted, disemboweled, or otherwise deconstructed, reconstructed, and whatnot. Because I guess this is where I also start with Max again, because a fashion show carries with it certain baggages of the gaze. When I watch a fashion show, I know what I'm doing to the models. I know what I'm doing to the garments. In a way, they are objects of consumption. Fashion is still subject to a kind of hyper-capitalist consumption model that exists, even though there's always that attempt to balance artistic and conceptual rigor. But ultimately, it exists within an industry. So maybe from this particular vantage point, I want to ask you, about how then did you blur or mess up or, work with but subvert the conventions of a fashion show?
Well, to begin with, I'm not. I don't see my practice as a commercial fashion designer for my fashion brand. This is where I've always been like an orphan child. Oh, I'm not really a fashion designer. I'm not really an artist. I'm not a product designer. Where do I fit in? and
Box. Absolutely.
And if I were to draw this big circle of arts, I think most people would see fashion as this offshoot little circle on the side, but I do see it as part of applied arts. And as a young nation, I mean, speaking with relevance to my discipline and industry, I think this is where I hope this work will serve to kickstart the conversation that fashion is not just about commerce anymore. We need to start thinking about how fashion can be a part of arts, or garments can be artistic instead of just looking at it as a product of function. Of course, I have my very, very editorial pieces, but then, when we look at a piece of commercial garment, what distills, what idea, what original idea did it come from that distills to this piece over here that still maybe retains a little bit of that artistic integrity, but I think in showing of Ang, I want to start that conversation that as a young nation, with little or no fashion industry and fashion design history, perhaps this is the time to start seeing fashion design from a new perspective and lens.
I wanted to ask about, how do you work with the gaze that is associated, with a fashion show, and then what you have brought up are very interesting reflections about then also artistic agency of breaking free and subverting the expectations of the format, justified or not, and warranted or not. And I think, it's just really interesting because we tend to associate a certain musicality, staging, visuality with fashion shows that brings to mind sometimes, that mechanical conveyor belt of pret-a-porter. But, here you have something that is so entirely raw, but also so subtle. And I was just wondering, whether you had an interior process to redo the format for your work.
I think I still want to keep something that it's. I don't want to throw put up a very unfamiliar show. So in this very familiar conveyor belt kind of lineup, rituals of a fashion show, there's some unfamiliarity that's being sprinkled around, and I think that's how I see I'm disrupting that ritual a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And then, of course, bringing it to 293 degree and Northwest. I have to confess, well, occasionally I have heard, you know, the music and the processions and some of the ceremonies. I have never actually managed to sit down, or maybe because I haven't been invited to many or any, Malay weddings, for example. And so, you know, now you're working with a different kind of temporality where it is both simultaneously presenting a kind of a complete event, but that is also hyper compressed.
Yes.
Because normally it would happen at a much longer duration, right? And I was just wondering, you know, what was that process of claiming that kind of agency to temporality, and what was it like to have to adapt to whatever time that you had to work with?
It wasn't just adapting towards time; it was adapting towards space, function, and I think the most important thing was we know that life is a journey, and it's a journey full of discovery. And at that point of time in your life, you go through this. So what is symbolic about this, and how can we bring that on stage? The gaze that you were talking about for Max. So there was a lot of this kind of dialogue and reflection for me as I approach creating this. And if you look at the triple bill show, you also want to be able to, you know, glide with Max's and then appear just nice before Mrs. Bhaskar's Arts Academy comes out. I was thinking about a lot of that, and because of that experience, we managed to bring about what is the key elements that you must have in the wedding. You must have the march past, you know. And you must have the guy who's holding the bunga mangga. You must have the silat. You know, you must have the banter.
Yes.
And then you must have the time, the first time when the husband sits beside the bride. And of course, love needs to be reciprocated. And how do we do that in a performative way? The whole village, you know, comes forward and join them in this celebration. But underneath that, you know, it's creating that narrative that we will bring you on a journey to unpack the Malay wedding. But underneath all of that, what is the meaning of this? And I think, you know, life is full of secrets.
True. Yeah, no, that's a really, really wonderful way of articulating that as well. It brings to mind the creations of categories, of classification. But what is so beautiful then, you know, for example, the works in ceremonial enactments, is that they actively defy classification because either there's no way to contain it or just the language hasn't appeared yet. And I'm, of course, reminded of, you know, that very, very brief and not all that utopian, but as utopian as it could get moment in the 50s and 60s with the golden age of Malay cinema, or Malayan cinema, with P. Ramlee, with the Shaw brothers, with the South Asian, with the Indian directors who are coming together to present this vision of something that actively could sustain itself. There was a celebration. The Chinese people weren't going around saying, "Oh, I'm not going to watch that because everything's in Bahasa Melayu. I will watch that. It is the cinema of this land. It's the cinema of this time." And this is also something that, you know, in a way, it's quite interesting because everyone touches on certain aspects that, for me, harkens back to that. You know, the dance, the music, the costume, the rigor, but also the spontaneity and the creativity. And yeah, more on agency and gaze, you know, then the last one, I also want to direct it to you, Meena. And of course then, how did you work with the existing repertoire that Mrs. Bhaskar has already developed, and then you having to, in a way, have your own creative interlocutions, yeah?
Yeah. So it's actually been just 6 weeks since I took over, and I've maintained, not touched her part at all. I started creating, but how I work is I work on something and then I sit back and I think back on it and see what it speaks to me, and then I ask myself a bunch of questions. Does it speak what I'm trying to say, or was it just gibberish? You know, so that's that's where I'm at right now, just 6 weeks into it. Because technically I've only had about 3.5 weeks of rehearsals with the girls. So, because it's just been, since my mom passed away, it's just been all the rituals and, you know, trying to get through that mourning and also, you know, catch up on all the work that needs to be done. So I'm just only this week having that bird's eye view on what I'm doing and going, this is where I really need to turn it and this is where I need to take it. So that's where I'm at right now. So being really honest. Yeah.
I want to pick
So,
up on,
yeah, and I mean, I haven't had conversations with the other artists. I've just been trying to understand her work and her direction and then bring it on her, right? And see how I can take it to where I am at. I mean, one of the most beautiful things that Natalie told me when she met with me and said, you know, we'd like for you to continue this, was, you know, I want you not to be, you know, beholden to what your mother was doing it. I want you to have the freedom to take it where you need to go, you know. So I'm going to start where my mom started and go where I need to go. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really
That's the
thoughtful.
gaze, yeah.
And that's really thoughtful as well, because I think that particularly I would say with Mrs. Bhaskar, who is a national treasure, and who is a legend. I think there's always on occasion the propensity to kind of oscillate between two polarities of being in the presence of a giant. Either you are overshadowed by the giants because it looms over you, or you are standing on the shoulder of the giants, ready to see the light.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that kind of tension, you know, and is also what creates really, really interesting conversation, particularly as someone who is not just actively maintaining, upholding a legacy, but also building a body of legacy behind. And I also want to pick up, for example, when you mentioned, you know, having a bird's eye view. In contemporary photography, it's really interesting how at one point in time, the bird's eye view, once we have access to satellite imaging, suddenly became God's eye view. Because there's that all-encompassing gaze that look at your flat plane of the earth, even though the earth is not flat.
Yeah.
But because of the specific gazes and lenses you train on it, it appears to be flat, it appears to be mutable, it appears to be manipulatable. But it's not, it's the earth, and it is where we are all actively existing and coexisting. And it is on this note where I want to bring out this somewhat inopportune quote that keeps bouncing in my head because of the richness of everyone's sharing from when I watched Mad Max Fury Road 3 years back. I watched it for Tom Hardy, that's why I watched it twice. I watched it for Charlize Theron too. And inside, one of the characters had this line that talked about how we live, we die, and we live again.
Yeah.
And that's what the arts do. And that's what ceremonies and rituals allow us to do.
Yeah.
And allow us to continue living even as we continue to die and to be reborn.
Yeah.
And that's all. Thank you.